Hey everyone, I want to give you a brief refresher, or this might be the first time you're seeing some of this material, on the sentimental Gothic myth. This is an idea that I'm borrowing from this critic named Mary K. Patterson Thornburg, and it appears in her book called The Monster in the Mirror, Gender and the Sentimental / Gothic Myth in Frankenstein. And Thornburg is making a big argument that the Gothic and the Sentimental, which are these two strands of literature that we find sometimes together, sometimes separate in the 18th century and in the 19th century as well, that they're really dependent on each other and that they come from an historical and cultural development that started in the 18th century. So, in effect, she's going to make an argument that the sentimental is kind of the conscious side of things, the side that we can admit to and the side we can believe in, and the Gothic is kind of the underside, the unconscious side of things, where all the kind of fun stuff goes on, all the scary stuff is on the Gothic side. So let's start with her quote up there. She calls it a desperate struggle to control the unconscious forces of human emotion, to make psychic reality consistent with practical, ostensibly rational human purposes. So you can imagine these are people who are confronted with the same kinds of emotions we all are, jealousy and rage and hatred. And what they prefer to do in the sentimental tradition is to sort of sweeten those and approach emotion more like Harley does in The Man of Feeling. So let's go down this list on the left side first, about thinking about sentimental qualities, and then on the right side thinking about Gothic qualities. The reason we're doing this right now is because Frankenstein is a book that very much sits right between these two, the sentimental and the Gothic. So we'll see the domestic values associated with the sentimental, but we'll also see the scary stuff that goes with the Gothic throughout this book. So we have a high-minded idealization of feeling, particularly over reason. If you think about Harley in The Man of Feeling, he lets feeling get him into all kinds of bad situations, like in the brothel, while reason would normally stop a person. And that's idealized in the text to some extent. The Man of Feeling is kind of a weird example because I think it's very self-conscious, but you can see where his emotion is sort of what makes him a good person. She says it has a pious, if often self-serving regard for the virtues of domesticity. If you think about Miss Walton here, part of the reason that she's a good person is she takes care of old Edwards's children. Or if you think about Hippolyta and Matilda, now while they're not doing domestic chores, they're certainly loving Manfred as a husband and a father, even though he was clearly a terrible guy. Exalted moral and societal virtues associated primarily with the Protestant middle class. This is where Thornburg has a kind of sociological side to her argument, where she's saying that this upcoming sort of growing middle class of the 18th century are the ones who really valued these emotions the way they did. It's because this class needed something, some kind of cultural capital to trade on, and so what they came up with were these kind of previously undefined emotions that suddenly become almost like currency among them. So, right, she says in kind of a funny way that their values is something like the Sermon on the Mount and the Protestant work ethic combined. So, meekness and mildness, surely, but also, you know, you better get to work and do something for yourself and accumulate a little capital. She says that the sentimental myth established proprieties and scales of value in all interpersonal dealings. So if we think about propriety, think about Theodore and Matilda. When Matilda freed Theodore from his prison cell in the castle of Otranto, there was a great deal of concern for the right way for him to speak to her and the right way for her to treat this single man she was suddenly alone with. Or if you think about the first volume of Frankenstein, the way that Victor values his friends, there's a great deal of emphasis put on personal relationships among these people. This is a huge one for Thornburg, and I think it's one that we're going to see more and more in Frankenstein as we go forward. This separation of male and female spheres of activity. So, you know, Victor goes off to the university while Elizabeth stays at home, and nobody raises an eyebrow about that, even though she seems to be really smart, just like Victor. And you might even think about how Alphonse and Caroline, Victor's parents, seem to have entirely different spheres. Alphonse is a syndic, right? He's an important public man. And Caroline is, you know, strictly a private woman. All she does is raise children and then die because of that. There was this idea that because women were less educated, they were morally superior to men. And we might see this with Justine, right? The servant who lives with Victor's family who's wrongly accused. she ends up looking much better than the court that convicts her. So there's a real comparison between sort of this innocent woman and this kind of awful court and public who's kind of, against her. Anti-sensuality, the sentimental tends to want to, at the same time it accentuates feeling, it wants to deny any connections of those feelings to sex. And so we could see that with, with Harley, right? So when he finally does get somewhere near some kind of sexual connection with Miss Walton, he actually dies. And that kind of connects us to this next point. These sentimental lovers usually triumph only in death, and there's this idealization of suffering. So if you think about Victor's description of Justine on page 61, if you have the Oxford edition, we get this description. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisitely beautiful. That's the end of the quote. So Justine always looks good, but when she's in mourning, she looks especially good. So here's your idealization of suffering. And oftentimes the hero's reward is the enjoyment of suffering. So think about the end of Castle of Otranto. Theodore and Isabella are going to live together forever in sort of a shared melancholy, which sounds pretty horrible to me, but in a sentimental context, it's the only sort of thing that's available to these characters. Sentimental characters are usually defined by fulfilling these roles that have been created for them over here. So good and bad, masculine and feminine. Think about Harley. He's portrayed as almost sort of too good for the world, and that's defined specifically in these kind of sentimental terms. Switching over to the Gothic side, all the stuff that got pushed down and ignored on the sentimental side comes sort of erupting out on this side. So she calls Mary Thornburg, the critic we're following, she calls the Gothic side a drama of violent conquest and submission taking place in all areas of human experience. So not just domestic and social, like we had on the sentimental side, but also political, cultural, economic, intellectual, scientific. And so obviously Victor runs away from the domestic world, right? When he goes to college, he sort of leaves the sentimental world and comes over to the Gothic world. And think about the terms in which he puts his desire for scientific success. On page 23, Victor says, "What glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death?" End quote. So here we see that it's conquest and submission. He's going to conquer death and go forward here. What else do we have? Attempts to portray not only the conscious ideals of the human race, but also those human truths that are repressed within the unconscious. To illustrate this, I want to look at the dream Victor has just after the creature comes online. The dream passage is early in figure 4, and it goes by quickly. Let's see. I thought I saw Elizabeth, in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead, my teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. That's Victor's dream. So I'm connecting it to this idea that we're going to get to these truths that are repressed within the unconscious. That's what dreams present us with, right? This is the side of things that we can't admit when we're waking. And so here's Victor's dream that looks not only at his sexual attraction to Elizabeth, which is something he doesn't address directly at all in his waking hours, but also the connection between sex and death, which is something that he doesn't want to look at in the morning. We say that the Gothic hero is sort of all the sentimental hero can't be, and so the Gothic hero, think about Manfred, right? Instead of sort of mediating himself and opening himself to these kind of fine emotions like Harley might, he varies back and forth between sort of cold calculation about how Isabella ought to marry him and these rages that he flies into. So it's all about passion and reason with him, and not at all about these sort of genteel emotions that a good sentimental hero might exercise. And then, yeah, I've said here the sentimental heroine becomes the lovely dying maiden. We might think about how we're getting away from, the sort of angel of the house, the domestic, non-sexual, perfect sort of woman that you might see in sentimental literature, and we end up with this kinds of heroine that's sexualized even in her death. And so we might think about what we just looked at, the passage about the dream, this connection between sex and death that's set up there. Or even back to Justine, who's valued for her beauty at the end of her life. So the sentimental often connects the sex to what's usually treated as just mere sensibility on the sentimental side. So the Gothic brings sex into things. And here again, I would point you back to Victor's dream, where what it should be this kind of pure and approved relationship between himself and Elizabeth turns into something sexual and then something much stranger in his dream. So just to sort of put a cap on this, the Gothic is everything that's kind of strange and counter and everything that's repressed that comes back in some other form later. And we end up with these repeated forms like doppelgangers, which just means, doubles. Like Walton and Victor seem to be doubles of each other somehow. Or, if we want to go back to the Castle of Otranto, Theodore was the double of Alfonso the Good, the painting, who he looks just like. So we have these weird doubles, which, if you look at that just from an anthropological perspective, doubles always creep people out. Twins are always weird. Creepy castles, we saw one of those very clearly in the Castle of Otranto, but even here in Frankenstein, we might think about how Victor's lab might play that role. And clearly, adapters of this novel understood that was the place to go for some really cool scenery in this story. Sublime nature, we see more in Book 2 than in Book 1, but the passage as Victor is on his way back home, on page 56, this big storm blows up, and this is a great example of sublime nature. So the sublime in nature is always about this power nature has that could utterly smash us at any moment. And Victor's watching the storm. While I watched the storm, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge." That's the end of the quote. But certainly sublime nature is something we'll talk more about in this text. And then incest is a common Gothic theme. And of course we have it here with Victor and Elizabeth, but we also had it in Castle of Otranto with Manfred and Isabella, which 18th century audiences definitely would have seen it as an incestuous connection. So we're seeing all these Gothic elements cropping up all over the place. All right, so that's a little bit of an idea of what's going on with the sentimental and the Gothic.